Mark Millar putting on his cape trying to save the comic book industry. Man, sit your ass down. Now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other two books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. Comic creator Mark Millar has a radical plan to save the comic book industry that I believe is destined to fail. Now, comic creator Mark Millar is the creator of the comic book series Wanted, which was adapted into a feature film by Hollywood and has had a deal for several of his properties to be adapted by Netflix. Now, Mark Millar is deeply concerned about the state of the comic book industry, which has gone from a slump in the 1990s with its first crash to a state of decline that it was from the late 90s to the 2010s to the rapid near implosion of the comic book industry, which has happened ever since 2015 with the implementation of the all-new, all-different Marvel and all of the chaos over at DC Comics. Now, Mark Millar is deeply concerned because he has many friends who are currently working in the comic book industry, and he fears that many of his friends will be put out of a job the way many comic creators wound up being put out of a job during the 1950s as we were going through those congressional hearings as related to seduction of the innocent and the complete decline in sales of comics back then. Now, Mark Millar is proposing a plan to try to save the comic book industry, and as he proposes to save the comic book industry, he is proposing that the big two comic publishers, Marvel Comics and DC Comics, change their royalty rate for creators from 2% for all of the work done by creators to 50%. And he's proposing that these creators be compensated on sales of books that are over 60,000 or more. Now, while Mark Millar's plan sounds great on the ideals, he doesn't really understand the realities of the world of publishing, and that is one of the core problems that has plagued the comic book industry for the last 25 years. Now, the big problem that's led to all the problems in the comic book industry really is the fact that the companies like Marvel and DC have not hired professionals with publishing experience. No, what they do is go out here and hire individuals who have no experience in the publishing business, and these individuals like Dan Didio, who came from Hollywood and had no publishing experience and started running DC Comics, and Joe Quesada, who was a creative artist and ran Marvel in 2001 but had no publishing experience. Both of these individuals did damage to their respective brands because neither of these men had publishing experience at all or understood how the business model of publishing works. And Mark Millar, like Dan Didio and Joe Quesada, is yet another creative individual who has absolutely no publishing experience and is making proposals to the business model and doesn't understand how the business model works. Now, as somebody who has been running a publishing company for the last 10 years out of his bedroom, I can tell you, as somebody with publishing experience, when I heard Mark Millar's proposal, the math just did not add up. Now, when it comes to publishing, most of the books, or 90% of them, fail, and it's the 10% of books that are successful are the ones that pay for the 90 that fail. And when you do the math on the profits from the 10%, as related to Mark Millar's spike in royalty rates, it makes it where the entire business model for publishing comics becomes completely unprofitable. Now, comic publishing and trade publishing in general are businesses with a razor thin profit margin. And again, I'll say it for everybody once more, it's the 10% of books that pay for the 90% that fail. And in that 10%, in order to get those profits, there are a lot of discounts that have to be given to retailers. Now, in order to get comics into the few comic book stores that are out there, a publisher has to go out here, and what they have to do is offer those distributors a discount of 50%. So let's say a book has a cover price of $5. What happens is that in order to get that book into the distributor's catalog, you have to offer it to them for a price of $2.50. And in order to be able to meet that cost of $2.50, what you have to do is make sure that that book's printing costs are under a certain price point. And this is something I myself had to do on multiple books in the SJS Direct imprint. In order for me to be able to charge a customer a book at a certain price in order to get a certain profit in terms of royalties, I have to factor in things like the page count and things like the overall size of the volume. For example, let's say I want to do a book like Spellbound, which was a book that was 6x9 in paperback, and if it's 6x9 in paperback, it's about 0.8 cents per page, and with the cover, it's about 7 cents. So the printing cost for that book may be about $1.50 or so. And then we factor in the discounts that are provided to retailers like Amazon, and that goes into the cost. And we also have to factor in, again, with the printing and the discounts, this is the little margin for profit. And if I price that book at $18, what I can get is a royalty of $5 on the Amazon platform. So that's what you can get in trade publishing if you do a paperback. And if you're doing a comic and you have that 50% discount already right there, and then you have your printing cost, which is another part of the price, and what you have left as related to profit is just a couple of like 25 to 50 cents a copy at best if you factor in all the discounts and the printing cost. And that's where Mark Millar gets it all twisted, because if you sell over 60,000 units and you wind up having to give 50% of that to the artist, guess what? There's no profit for the publisher. So while he proposes that there's no skin in the game for him, there is no skin in the game for publishers and no incentive for them to keep printing comics based on his modification of the business model. Again, this business model has a razor-thin profit margin, and his math is so fuzzy that he's not looking at the numbers, because he's thinking that, oh, we can give them 50%, but if you give them 50%, the publisher takes a big loss as related to each of the books that are printed. Yes, you may get the sales on volume, but as you're printing all of these books and shipping all of these books, you're taking a loss on each unit, and that doesn't, again, give the business an incentive to continue publishing these books. So his business model comes from someone who really needs to study the publishing industry and how the business model works. Now, Mark also doesn't factor in how paying creators more isn't going to lead to an increase in sales. No, if I go out here and give the creators a 50% royalty, that does not impact one of the big problems in the comic book industry, and that big problem is distribution. Now, when it comes to comic book distribution, for years there was a monopoly with Diamond Comics distributors, and I believe that that distribution model has been shattered recently, too little, too late, and what we have now are a series of distributors out there, but the big problem is that comics are not in the places they used to be in the 1980s and the 1990s, because I remember growing up in the 80s and the 90s, and comics were everywhere, from the grocery stores to the supermarkets to the drugstores to even stores that were in business at the time, like Woolworth, or even in my neighborhood, the Arab cigar store on Fordham Road, or there was a brother on Fordham Road selling comics. There was always a place to get comics, but these days the only place to get comics is the comic shop, and it's a major chore to get to comic shops unless you're living in cities like New York. And even here in New York, it's starting to get harder because many of the shops that I used to frequent back in the day, like Jim Hanley's Universe, is no longer in Manhattan anymore. And I haven't been to Forbidden Planet in years, but there are not that many comic shops like there were back when I was a teenager in 1987. I mean, I remember when there were multiple comic shops. There was Forbidden Planet on 59th Street near Bloomingdale's. There was Forbidden Planet on 14th Street in Union Square. And there was other comic shops like Village Comics in the late 80s, Jim Hanley's in the 90s near the Manhattan Mall. I mean, there were comic shops everywhere, and you could get many of the harder to find titles that you couldn't get up in the Bronx at the Arab cigar stores or the newsstands. You could get them at the comic shops, and a lot of those businesses stopped selling comics because they couldn't not only get the discount, but the problem was they did not have returnability. Now, another problem with the entire comic publishing business is the comic publishing business did away with returnability when they left the traditional market and entered the direct market. Now, the returnability is a major incentive for retailers because retailers do not like shrink. And one of the things that happens with comics is that as they are in a store, people pick them up, they look them over, they flip through the pages. If they don't buy them, and the owner, if they can go out here and send them back, they can send them back for credit back in the days before the direct market. And what they would do is go out here, and if the books didn't sell, pack them up, send them back, and get credit on next month's books. But with the direct market and comic shops, those comic shops are basically stuck with those books that don't sell. And some guys in the short term in the 90s thought that that was a good deal because they could pack those books in some Millar bags and stick them in their back issues, or they could put them for a short sale in the dollar bins and the quarter bins and at least recoup their minimum cost on these books. But what's been happening ever since 2011, when Dan Didio implemented the new 52 and Joe Quesada basically took over Marvel in 2001, is it's been getting harder to sell many of those back issues that were not returnable because of Marvel and DC's inept editorial, constantly canceling series, constantly rebooting series, or going out here and murdering and mutilating characters. That doesn't give customers incentive to go buy the back issues, and they have no incentive to buy the back issues if a series is going to be canceled and rebooted, or if an entire universe is going to be wiped out like the new 52. That doesn't give many customers to go have an opportunity to go search through the back issues if all of the previous issues are invalidated by a cancellation and a reboot. So this is the start of why many comic shops have been struggling to move back inventory, and because they can't move the back inventory, this is what leads to comic shops not being able to pay their bills, and this is what leads to them winding up being forced to go out of business. You'll have some that will say, oh, it's the SJW comics that were the start of the comic shops closing. But no, comic shops have been struggling since, I say, about 2001 and 2002. And they've been struggling because you have people who have no publishing background running a publishing house, because that's what a comic book company is. It's a publishing house. And as these inexperienced people have been running the publishing house, we have seen standards decline as related to there being no house style, there being no house model for storytelling, and no house art direction. There has been no house at Marvel or DC, and without that structure to set standards for the company in terms of character design, in terms of biz story models, and in terms of overall creativity, this has led to the decline in quality, and that decline in quality took a major tumble around 2015 at Marvel and 2016 at DC with the convergence. And while DC tried to right itself with Rebirth, it was too little too late, because again, you have Dan Didio, an inexperienced person running the company, and over at Marvel you had Axel Alonso, again a guy with no publishing experience, running the business, and both businesses were running into the ground. Unfortunately, as both businesses were running into the ground, they didn't understand that they were both the backbone of the comic shop. The comic shop made 90% of its money from both Marvel and DC comics, and the indie comics got their sales indirectly from those buyers of Marvel and DC comics. Unfortunately, the problems in editorial are the main reason why Marvel and DC are a mess, and why the business and distribution are a mess as well. So when I look at the bigger panoramic picture of the comic book industry from a publisher's perspective, going out here and giving the artist a bit more money to get more sales, it's not going to even start to even fix any of the problems, not even going to fix any of the problems that have been plaguing the industry for the last, I say, 25 to 30 years. No, giving artists another 50%, it just does not add up mathematically when you go out here and crunch the numbers. And I have been crunching the numbers for years for my own books, because in order for me to be able to give readers a book at a certain price point, I've got to go out here and assess the page count, the discounts, and go out here and assess the overall price, because in order for me to pull any sort of profit on a book, I have to make sure that things are going to calculate as related to this book paying out. And a lot of times, even with all those calculations to make a book pay out, I've got to sell a certain amount of units. And that's why you see me all the time going out here making videos, promoting books, posting ads for my books, something you don't really see many of these modern comic pros going out here and doing. No, with most modern comic pros, they have gone out here looking to stir controversy in clickbait articles, rather than go out here and try to sell their work based on what's presented on the page. And that's what Mark Millar doesn't really understand, is another part of what's really hurting the comic book industry, is that today's modern comic pros are more interested in controversy rather than sales. They're more interested in posting all sorts of crazy stuff on Twitter and Instagram, rather than going out here and selling their work. They're not interested in trying to get those 60,000 sales by saying, oh, my book is coming out this week, my book is coming out, take a look at what this book is like, posting up pages of the work. No, what they're doing is going out here making rants about Donald Trump, or going out here, getting into things like the Whisper Network and getting into it, gossip with people. No, there's a big professionalism problem as related to comics, and Mark Millar is not really paying attention to that aspect, and he's not paying attention to other aspects that are hurting the comic book industry. Now, I'll agree with him, sadly, that yeah, these page rates would be considered to be low if compared to what he was getting back in the day, where he was getting what he said $1,000 a page. But we're not in the 1980s anymore, and the age of the superstar creators like himself and Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, who could command that $1,000 page rate. Because if you are a guy who's out here selling 500,000 to 1,000,000 units, yeah, you can command $1,000 page rate, because the company can absorb that loss, because they're going to pull a profit on that book, which is a part of the 10% of books that do well. But in today's comic book industry, almost 99.9% of the books fail or are on the brink of collapse, and the 0.1% of books are not enough to cover the cost of all of the books that have poor sales. Because back from the 80s to the mid 90s, yeah, there were books out there that, like the X-Men, which were selling 500,000 units. I mean, Spider-Man was selling 500,000 units. The Hulk was selling a good 350 to 400,000 units, and even B-listers like Iron Man and Captain America. Yes, Iron Man and Captain America were B-listers in the 80s. They were selling 250,000 books a month. So these books were actually pulling a bit of a profit compared to low books on the lower end, like the Alpha Flights and books like Excalibur, which was a top 10 book for a while. I mean, if these books were selling these six figures like this, yeah, I can go out here and pay $1,000 a page. But in today's market, many books are out here barely selling about, I say, 3,000-4,000 units. I mean, Batman was a 50,000 unit seller for a good 3 or 4 years, but now he's basically down in the, I say, 25,000 range. And that was an A-list book at one time. That was one of DC's 500,000 unit sellers back in the late 80s and early 90s when the movie was out. But now books are not selling very well, and comic publishers, in order to be able to just keep these books printed, what they do is, because they need to maintain their budget, because even though they are subsidiaries of corporations like Disney and Warner Brothers Discovery, a publishing house is given a budget, and in order to keep a budget, this is why you see these books being done by what people call these terrible, inexperienced artists. Well, they're done by them because the publisher's budget has been slashed, because they don't really need the publisher outside of keeping the trademarks alive, because these books are loss leaders for them. So what they do is hire these guys who can do maybe 90 to 150 a page or 250 a cover, because they're not selling as many units, and they have no real incentive to go out here and try to sell those units, because the comic book business really has not done anything to try to fix its business model. And what's really impeding the comic book business is it doesn't have returnability. And again, returnability is important in order to get into retail, because the returnability means that once these units don't sell, they can pack them up and send them back for credit. That is what's done with every trade book out there. If the book doesn't sell on the shelf, the retailer packs that book up after 3-6 months and sends it back for a new title, and gets credit for the previous titles that don't sell. And comics don't have returnability, and that's what's hurt the comic shops. Overall, the comic shops have been suffering because they're stuck with a whole bunch of bad comics, and those bad comics are, again, done because there's no of the poor editorial. And the real big problem with comics is we get a lot of people who are creative want to come and start running the business, and it's a problem. And sadly, none of these people are business people like Jim Shooter was, because a lot of people think that Jim Shooter was a jerk, but Jim Shooter was a brilliant businessman, and a brilliant businessman who managed to turn Marvel around because he ran Marvel like a business, and he ran Marvel like a business, understanding how to sell books, because your job is to sell books and make sure that that these retailers and distributors are happy. And that's something that's not really being focused on by Marvel's current and DC's current editorial. They're not really going out here producing the kinds of middle of the road books that were produced in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s at Marvel and DC that really appealed to a larger audience. No, today's modern comics are these really unreadable books that as I've looked at them, are just a complete mess. And they're a complete mess and very hard to read, very hard to access. And this is from somebody who's been a comics fan since he was 4 years old. I mean, I'm a 50-year-old man who's been reading comics ever since I was 4 in 1978. And today's comics the continuity is just, it's a jumbled mess from all of the reboots and retcons. It's the artwork is just, it's inconsistent from book to book and even series to series that from each reboot. And everything about comics is a complete mess. And Mark Millar's radical plan would do nothing to change anything, but all it shows me from him is that while he's made a lot of changes by becoming a part of Hollywood, he would only exacerbate the problems over at Marvel and DC and the comic book industry if he were to implement his plan, because like Dan Didio and Joe Quesada before him, he would be just as inexperienced about the business of publishing. And what comics has always needed is a seasoned publishing professional to try to clean up this mess. But no publishing professional would want to touch today's modern comic book industry, which is in the last stages of implosion. I mean, the comic book industry at this point is in a place where it can't be fixed, and its business model basically at this point has been rendered obsolete, because when I look at the comic book industry and Mark Millar's proposal, one of the things he's saying is he wants to bring in veteran comic professionals to come into the industry to try to save it. But what he doesn't understand is that the money that would be presented would be nothing to any veteran comic creator, because the business model has changed to the point where no veteran creator would even want to care about the current archaic comic book business model, because there's no money in it for them. Even if you drove up that royalty rate to 50%, there wouldn't be enough money for them, because many of these comic pros, they have made all of their money through other ventures, and the whole crowdfunding marketplace is more financially lucrative for them than the old comic model, because in the old comic model, everything is work for hire, and in work for hire, a creator owns nothing, and if they're lucky, they get that 2% royalty, and that's nothing compared to the billions the company will make on an IP if it becomes popular, like a character like Deadpool, which is now on all sorts of merchandise and having movies made out of him. So a creator has no incentive to bring characters into a company like Marvel or DC, because I have no incentive to do that, and I aspire to want to work at places like Marvel and DC. No, the crowdfunding business model has made it where most veteran creators can want to go out here and, if they want to make a comic, they'll announce that on social media, and as they announce that on social media, what they will do is go out here and make six figures for themselves, and they'll be able to go out here and maintain ownership of their intellectual property. And as they maintain ownership of their intellectual property, they can then go out here and hire an agent to represent them, have that agent go out here and finesse deals to have them license the for merchandise, license it for film and television, license it for all sorts of other merchandising, and take all of that profit and create and have that wealth building asset make all that money for them. And that's more lucrative for them than some work for hire contract writing somebody else's character like Batman, Superman, or Wonder Woman. And that was one of the reasons why I had written a blog about a proposed Wonder Woman run. And after I proposed that Wonder Woman run, I said to myself, this is completely foolish. I have Isis, my character I created back in 2002. I'll take all of these stories I proposed for Wonder Woman and I will write them as Isis stories, and that's how I started the Isis series on the SJS Direct imprint. I said it would be completely foolish for me to just write Wonder Woman stories that on a character I don't own and go out here, and if I did get to do them, I'd have to go through DC's editorial process, which would be a nightmare, and deal with all that stress. No, it would be just better for my mental health and also more profitable for me to go out here and publish my own stories, own my own imprint, own all of the rights to that characters, own all the trademarks to that character, own all of the rights as related to intellectual property, and go out here and be able to produce my own material and have complete ownership of it. So that was another part of Mark Millar's proposal. He was saying, oh, let's get 20 veteran creators, but what veteran creator would want to come back to Marvel and DC to save Marvel and DC when there's no money in it for them? They can make all their money through crowdfunding with Kickstarter, with Indiegogo, or in the case of Eric July, just create your own crowdfunding platform. You could make more money on these platforms, and all that money's coming to you outside of Kickstarter and Indiegogo fees, and that's more lucrative for a creator than sitting there saying, I'm going to sit here and wait for Marvel and DC to notice me. And I'm one of those guys who was waiting for years for Marvel and DC to notice me. I mean, people know who I am. They know me on the CBR boards. I was talking to a Facebook friend. He said he had been heard about me far back as 2012, and people knew about me for years. And people outside of the comic book industry, they could come and talk to me, but many in the comic book industry didn't want to talk to a guy like me who knew the business. And that's the thing that is why the industry is in a bad place, because they're not wanting to talk to people who are publishing professionals or looking to go out here and help people develop their craft. Now, I've heard another point from some people where they talk about, oh, all these people are at the bottom are working in comics. Well, those people are working in comics because the comic book industry usually is a place where people go when they are either in two places in their writing careers. One, they are in doing comics because they are looking to start their careers in writing, or two, they are in comics because they can't find any other place to go. That's what I found out from family members out here. They were telling me not to get really into comics. I wanted to be in comics ever since I was a kid, but I couldn't get into comics, and I started doing other forms of publishing. I mean, before I did self-publishing and indie publishing, I had done articles for an indie newspaper. I had done articles for when I was working at the job at America or Vista at Strive. And as I was doing as I was learning about screenwriting and I was out here doing blogging, I had a best-selling author friend telling me about writing nonfiction, and I didn't know that there were hierarchies to publishing. And in the hierarchy of publishing, comics is at the bottom. And usually, if you're good, you can work your way out of comics and work your way into either novels or journalism. But the high point of writing, as I've learned, is nonfiction. Nonfiction is the big money in publishing, and I have been doing like nonfiction for years. I didn't even know that was considered the top level of publishing when you can go out here and write nonfiction books. But usually, many people, if they're good, they start to graduate out of comics, or if they aspire to get into comics, they go into other fields. I mean, there are more lucrative fields in writing, and people usually just move out of comics into either doing novels, doing screenplays, doing grant and proposal writing, or going out here and writing nonfiction. So the reason why you see people who are getting paid these pennies on the dollar for doing comics is because they are either starting out or they can't get anywhere else. And the sad part is with the whole comic book industry is that you have people trying to bring back the glory days of the 80s and the 90s, but you can't bring those glory days back because the business model is basically obsolete at this point, because in the 21st century, what has happened is crowdfunding has basically rendered the overall comics model obsolete. So all of these guys talking about, oh, we can save Marvel and DC. No, we can't save them at all. The only thing that Disney and Warner Brothers Discovery are going to do is keep these businesses operational, printing books at a loss, and they're going to print those books at a loss because they want to go out here and use these properties for adaptation. So the whole thing of saving the comic book industry, there's no saving it at this point. What's happening now is the industry is eventually going to collapse as related to the direct market business model, because the direct business market model is unsustainable, and it's been unsustainable for a good 20 years, and the smart people have jumped off that bandwagon like I did with going into creating my own publishing imprint back in 2009, and others now are creating their own imprints and owning their property because the traditional comic book business model is obsolete, and even by Mark Millar's own math is not sustainable. It's just not sustainable because you cannot give a creator a 50% royalty when you have to give a distributor a 50% discount, and you have to pay your printing cost. Once you do the math on your comics, you will see that it's just not possible to implement any of Mark Millar's plans, like bringing in these veteran comic pros. I mean, many of these veteran comic pros, these page rates would not be interested. They would not be interested in them, and they wouldn't be interested in them because they know if they could just say they're going to launch a Kickstarter, they're going to be getting at least about $5,000 to $10,000 on the opening day, and that is enough to cover the basics of cost for their comic. I mean, if you have a seasoned professional who has years of good sales numbers, they can go out here, take their own character, make it and their own IP, and launch it. And that's what I wanted to, when I did with John Haynes at Death's Door. Again, I launched my own thing. I had to save all my money off the site to do it. But when I go out here, I've always wanted to do an ISIS comic, and I'm trying to do that right now. But many of these veterans who have that name and reputation, all they have to do is say, hey, I'm making a comic, and that comic is assured to go out here and do 6 figures or high 5 figures on opening day, because these guys are no names. So why would they want to go out here and work for $1,000 a page at Marvel and DC on a character they don't own, when they can go out here and make 6 figures or high 5 figures on a character they do own? That's a critical question I would like to ask Mark Millar in person regarding his proposal, because he's made proposals that really, again, show his lack of knowledge of the publishing business. And the big problem I see with him and his predecessors like Dan Didio and Joe Quesada is it's their lack of experience in the publishing business that has led to the comic book industry being in the place that it's currently in. And his proposal would not save the comic book industry. It would lead it to be driven to its further demise, and it would be driven to its further demise because paying artists more doesn't go out here and get you more sales when comics are not sold in venues where people are congregating. I mean, one of the great tragedies of the entire superhero film craze of the late 2000s to the 2020s is that we have not seen comic sales rise in proportion to the billion-dollar box offices of the MCU and some of the DC movies. That is the great tragedy, because I remember in 1989, when I was attending Park West High School, I remember when Batman sales got a huge spike from the '89 Batman movie, and even though Tim Burton's movie was designed completely different from the Jim Aparo comics at the time, they basically captured the heart of them, and people flocked to the stores and to go buy Batman comics, and that was because there was still a good distribution business model so that these comics could be in the hands of readers. And sadly, because we don't have a good editorial team, what happened was we didn't, as the DC was out here making its DC Extended Universe with its dark, gritty Man of Steel, it was hard to sell Superman because Superman, we didn't know who he was because Dan Didio messed up the continuity with the New 52, the Convergence, the Rebirth. We didn't know who he was to recognize him. And Batman and Wonder Woman, I mean, these films, like Wonder Woman, made $1 billion, but none of those people came to the shops to buy the comics or the merchandise. And in the same case of the MCU, you had all of these Iron Man, Captain America, Thor movies, but people weren't going to the comic shops because they didn't even know, one, if there was a comic shop in their neighborhood, and if they got there, they didn't know that the character was there, because at the time, instead of Tony Stark, we had Riri Williams as Ironheart, we had Sam Wilson as Captain America, we had Jane Foster as Thor, so there was no way to cross-market these characters to reach new readers with these books, and that was the great travesty of bad editorial. So when I look at what happened over at Marvel and DC right now, again, it's a great tragedy, but sadly, you have guys like Mark Millar thinking that the solution is just paying people more, and again, paying people more who have no talent and no creative experience. That's what's led to the disaster we have right now, because Dan Didio was a guy with no publishing experience, Joe Quesada had no publishing experience, and it was like the blind leading the blind, and that's why the industry is in the ditch right now. And what we need right now, what we've needed for years, is a publishing professional to come into the comic book business. But that's something that, again, it's too little too late at this point, because any publishing professional would look at the total wreck of the comic book industry and look at the business model and realize that there's no way they could go out here and fix this. No, this business model is completely FUBAR at this point, and with it being completely FUBAR at this point, the only thing that people like myself are doing is just walking away, and we walk away because there's no way to fix an industry that is this close to implosion, and there's no way to fix it because, again, the financial incentives just aren't there. The financial incentives aren't there for creators. The financial incentives aren't there for anybody who is qualified in management. No, everything as related to trying to fix the comic book industry, we've gone past that. The last point I think you could have fixed it would be maybe 2006, 2007. You might have had a chance to fix it. But once Dan Didio implemented the New 52 and we got the all-new, all-different Marvel, that's where the entire industry jumped the shark. And while Mark Millar may have many friends who are struggling at this point, and I feel for those people, at this point, there's nothing much anybody can do except go out here and start looking for another job, or start looking to develop some other business venture, because the modern comic book industry at this point, it's on the brink of collapse, and the only thing anybody can do at this point is just get out of the way so that they can avoid winding up losing their professional life in the ruins of this industry. Now, my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available on Lulu.com right now. And if you want to pick up a paper copy and check out how I would write a comic, you can head over to Lulu.com by clicking the link in the description box and getting your copy of John Haynes at Death's Door. And if you want to get my first full digital comic, A Steam No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents. And if you want a paper copy of Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic in the book Esteem Blast from the Past on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find Esteem No Good, you can find it on Kindle for 99 cents. And if you want to help me be able to make my next comic, which I want to do about Isis, the goddess next door, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu, John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewolf in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman in paperback and e-readers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.